Before we begin, I just want to say thank you for being here and to let you know how you can get in touch with the show. If you'd like to share your thoughts on this episode, suggest a case, or request a shout out, you can find What They Hide Hidden Crimes in Plain Sight on social media. You can follow and message a podcast on X and Blue Sky. Just search at What They Hide Pod on both. You can also email the show directly at whattheyhidepod@gmail.com. The details will be in the episode description. I read every message and I really appreciate you taking the time to reach out. Alright, let's crack on with the show. We walk past them every day. The neighbour who waves from across the street. The business owner who locks up after dark. The man in the suit. The woman behind the desk. Ordinary faces. Ordinary lives. But some crimes don't happen in back alleys or abandoned buildings. They happen in plain sight. Hidden behind routine. Hidden behind reputation. Hidden behind the comfort of normal. This is not a show about myths. It's about facts. Real investigations, real victims, real offenders who operated quietly while the world kept turning. Every episode we pull back the surface, examining the evidence, the psychology, the systems that failed, and the warning signs no one saw until it was too late. Because the most unsettling truth is this: monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like someone you already trust. This is What They Hide. Hidden crimes in plain sight. And this is the story of Peter Moore, the man in black. This episode contains discussion of real-life murder and violence. Especially for those sensitive to themes of violent crime, listener discretion is strongly advised. In 1995, Peter Moore was not an outsider in North Wales. He was 48 years old, a businessman, the manager and owner of local cinemas. A man who had lived in the region for years. He drove familiar roads, operated legitimate businesses, paid bills, spoke with customers. If you saw him, you wouldn't see chaos, you'd see routine. Moore was known for wearing black. Black shirts, black trousers, black coats, so consistently that it became a local identifier. During his 1996 trial, prosecutor Alex Carlisle QC would seize on that image, calling him the man in black, black thoughts and the blackest of deeds. It was a line meant to crystallise what the prosecution argued, that beneath an orderly exterior was sustained, deliberate violence. But in the months before his first arrest, there was no public sense of a looming serial killer. There was fear, yes. 4 men would be murdered between September and December 1995, but the idea that the perpetrator was a known local businessman had not yet taken hold. That's what makes this case so deeply unsettling. North Wales is geographically beautiful and geographically isolating. Anglesey, rural stretches of the A5, woodland near Ruthin, Penzance Beach near Abergele. In daylight, these places are open and ordinary. At night they become something else. Quiet, unlit, removed from immediate help. Moore knew these locations. He drove them regularly. His businesses gave him mobility, flexibility, reasons to travel. Nothing about his movements appeared suspicious on its face. He had legitimate explanations for being out late. Cinemas close after dark. Managers stay late. Equipment fails. Films need changing. Normal life provided cover. By the time Moore stood trial, the prosecution presented him not as a man who suddenly snapped in 1995, but as someone with a longer history of violent sexual offending against men. During proceedings, the court heard evidence of prior assault stretching back years, attacks on men in isolated areas, often involving impersonation or intimidation. In some accounts, he posed as a police officer to gain compliance. The pattern suggested planning and control rather than spontaneous rage. This context is important because when 4 men were murdered in rapid succession in late 1995, investigators would eventually argue that the killings were not an abrupt beginning, but an escalation. Escalation is a key word here. Between September and December 1995, Henry Roberts, 56, was killed on Anglesey. Edward Carthy, 28, was killed after being taken from Liverpool into North Wales. Keith Randles, 49, was killed near the A5, and Anthony Davies, 40, was killed at Penzance Beach. 4 men, roughly 3 months. That compression of time is critical. It suggests increasing frequency, increasing risk, increasing boldness. And during that time period, Moore continued operating his cinemas. There was no public unravelling. People often expect violent offenders to look unstable, to appear socially disconnected or visibly erratic, but Moore maintained a structured life. He handled staff, dealt with suppliers, interacted with customers, conducted business transactions, paid for petrol, he filed paperwork. This is not speculation, it's documented reality. His arrest did not come after a visible breakdown, it came after physical evidence linked him to the final crime scene in December 1995. Up until that point, he blended in. And blending in is not accidental. Serial offenders who sustain activity over time often rely on predictability, routine, controlled environments, and familiar territory. Moore's clothing, his consistent black attire, wasn't proof of anything criminal, but it did contribute to a fixed persona. People remembered him, they recognised him. He was not faceless, which raises an unsettling truth. Sometimes visibility is its own camouflage. If everyone knows you, they are less likely to question you. Another factual layer presented at trial was the targeting of men in contexts tied to the gay community, bars, cruising locations and discreet meeting places. In 1995, stigma around sexuality, particularly in smaller or rural communities, remained significant. Reporting sexual assault or violence in those contexts could mean exposing deeply personal aspects of one's life. Predators can exploit that vulnerability. The prosecution's case suggested Moore sought out men in these environments, using isolation and, at times, impersonation to gain compliance before violence. The pattern was not random street attacks in crowded spaces, it was controlled encounters in secluded areas. That distinction is important, it reflects the intent. By September 1995, the violence had crossed the threshold. Henry Roberts' killing marked the beginning of a sequence that would terrorise parts of North Wales. Each subsequent death deepened police concern. The locations varied, but they shared isolation, limited witnesses, and darkness. At that stage, investigators did not publicly announce a serial killer. Cases were being worked individually, but behind the scenes patterns were forming. Vehicles seen, timelines overlapping, geographic clustering, and more remained in motion throughout that same region, driving roads he had always driven, wearing the same black clothes, managing the same cinemas. There is no record of him fleeing, no evidence he attempted to abandon his businesses or disappear. He stayed. That's what makes the first bit of this story so gripping. Not dramatic chaos, but controlled normality. When Moore was eventually arrested in December 1995, it was not because of rumour or intuition, it was because of evidence. Blood evidence linking him to the murder of Anthony Davies at Penzance Beach. Only then did the dual life collapse. Only then did investigators begin pulling together the broader pattern that would lead to 4 murder convictions. But in months before that arrest, Peter Moore was simply a man going about his life in North Wales. A man people recognised. A man who ran cinemas. A man in black. And that's the core tension of this case. Not how someone hides in darkness, but how someone stands under ordinary light and is never truly seen. Between September and December 1995, 4 men were murdered in North Wales. At first, the cases did not publicly appear connected. Different locations, different circumstances, different backgrounds. But by the end of December, investigators would understand they were dealing with a single offender. And the pace of the killings is what makes this stretch of time so chilling. 4 men, roughly 12 weeks. Henry Roberts, 56, lived on Anglesey. On the 19th of September 1995, he was attacked outside his home in Llanfairpwll. The assault was sustained and violent. He died from multiple stab wounds. This was not a spontaneous altercation in a crowded setting. It happened at night, outside his residence, an environment that should have felt secure. The prosecution later argued that Moore had gone to Roberts' home deliberately. This was targeted violence, not random street crime. At this stage, there was no public declaration of a serial pattern. It was a murder investigation, serious, urgent, but still singular. What investigators did not yet know was that this was the beginning of a rapid escalation. On the 19th of November 1995, Edward Carthy, 28, was in Liverpool. He was last seen alive after leaving a gay bar. According to the prosecution, case presented at trial, Moore met Carthy in Liverpool and drove him across the border into North Wales. Carthy's body was later discovered in woodland in Clochenog Forest near Ruthin. The distance matters. This was not a killing in the heat of confrontation. It involved transport, movement across counties, a controlled location to a secluded environment. The forest location was isolated, rural and dark at night. It suggests planning and familiarity with terrain. By this point, 2 men were dead within 8 weeks, one in Anglesey, one in remote woodland, but publicly the link was not yet cemented. Just days later, on the 26th of November 1995, Keith Randles, 49, was killed. Randles worked as a traffic manager. He was attacked near the A5 on Anglesey. Again, the location was significant, a stretch of road known for its relative isolation after dark. At trial, prosecutors described a pattern of Moore targeting men in circumstances where he could isolate and overpower them. 3 murders in just over 2 months. For investigators, alarm bells were now undeniable. Geography was tightening. Anglesey had seen 2 killings, a forest in Denbighshire another. The timing was accelerating. This was no longer coincidence. On the 12th of December 1995, Anthony Davies, 40, was at Penzance Beach near Abergele. Penzance was known as a meeting place, particularly after dark. Davies was attacked and fatally stabbed, but this scene was different. Davies fought back, and that resistance changed the course of the investigation. During the struggle, Moore sustained injuries. Blood evidence recovered from the scene would later be linked to him. This was the first hard forensic break investigators needed. Up until then, the pattern had been behavioural and geographic. Now it was biological. 4 victims: Henry Roberts, 19th of September, Edward Carthy, 19th of November, Keith Randles, 26th of November, and Anthony Davies, the 12th of December. The spacing is striking. 2 months between the first and second killing, 1 week between the second and third, and just over 2 weeks to the fourth. Escalation is often marked by decreasing intervals between offences. This is exactly what happened here, and the methods shared critical elements. Nighttime attacks, isolated locations, targeted male victims, use of a knife, and evidence of control rather than chaotic frenzy. The prosecution would later argue these were deliberate acts committed for personal gratification and domination, not provoked confrontations. During Moore's eventual confession, later retracted, he described the killings in disturbingly detached terms, reportedly saying it was for fun and that it was easy. Those statements, introduced in court through witness accounts of the confession, reinforced what investigators already suspected. These were not impulsive acts, they were chosen. By December 1995, the atmosphere had shifted. 4 men were dead, 2 on Anglesey alone. Rural communities talk. Patterns circulate in whispers before they appear in headlines. Men who frequented secluded meeting areas became wary. Some stopped going, others went in groups. Police presence increased. But until the forensic link at Penzance, there was no name to attach to the fear. The killer was still abstract, still faceless, still moving through daily life unnoticed. The blood recovered at Penzance Beach tied more directly to Anthony Davies' murder. When police searched Moore's property, they discovered items that connected him to victims and the attacks. What had been a tightening pattern suddenly snapped into focus. The man who had been driving familiar roads, running cinemas and wearing black every day was no longer background. He was central. And the realisation that a known local businessman was responsible for 4 murders in 3 months sent shockwaves through North Wales. 4 men killed in less than a season, not in chaotic outbursts, not in crowded streets, but in darkness, in isolation, in places chosen carefully. By December 1995, the investigation had shifted from searching for a shadow to building a case against a man everyone thought they understood. And next, he would begin to talk. By mid-December 1995, the investigation had turned. The murder of Anthony Davies at Penzance Beach did what the previous 3 crime scenes had not. It yielded forensic evidence that pointed back, unmistakably, to one man. Peter Moore was arrested on the 20th of December 1995. He was 48 years old. A cinema manager, a local businessman, the man in black. He was taken into custody and interviewed by North Wales Police. And at first, like many suspects facing overwhelming evidence, he denied everything. Police had something different this time. During the struggle at Penzance, Anthony Davies fought back. In that fight, Moore was injured. Blood recovered at the scene was analysed and matched to him. That forensic link collapsed the distance Moore had maintained between himself and the crimes. He could no longer be just a man who happened to drive the same roads. He was physically present at the last murder scene. Investigators also began recovering items during searches: clothing, knives and belongings connected to victims. The case was no longer circumstantial pattern recognition. It was evidential. And inside an interview room in the early hours before Christmas, the pressure mounted. It was the early hours of the 24th of December 1995, Christmas Eve. While much of North Wales was preparing for holiday celebrations, Peter Moore was in a police station interview room. Present was solicitor Dylan Rees-Jones, who would later recount what happened that night. Moore asked to speak, and then he began to confess. According to published accounts of the interview, Moore said, "I want to admit the murder on Penzarn Beach and another murder in Clochainog Forest." Clochainog Forest. At that point, investors had not publicly confirmed all the connections between the cases. Moore was now placing himself at multiple scenes. He did not stop at one admission. He described killing Anthony Davies. He described killing Edward Carthy in the forest. He described killing Keith Randles. He described killing Henry Roberts. 4 murders, 1 voice, inside a fluorescent lit room while the rest of the country slept. What makes this sequence so chilling is not just that he confessed, it's how. Accounts from that night describe Moore speaking calmly, not shouting, not breaking down, not dissolving into hysteria. Controlled, measured. At one point, when asked why he committed the killings, Moore reportedly answered, "I said that it was for fun." That word, fun, landed heavily in court when later repeated. Not revenge, not self-defense, not panic. Fun. In another reported remark describing the act of stabbing, Moore said, "It was easy, just like a knife through butter." Those are not the words of someone claiming accident. They are the words of someone describing experience. The confession did not remain confined to the 4 murders. Moore also spoke about previous violent sexual assaults on men dating back years, attacks involving impersonation, threats and knives. These admissions aligned with earlier unsolved reports across North Wales. The portrait emerging in that interview room was not of a sudden killer who snapped in 1995. It was of a man who had been escalating, testing, refining, and finally crossing into serial murder. For detectives, this was both a breakthrough and horror. They were not simply solving one case. They were uncovering the depth of a predator who had operated quietly within their jurisdiction for years. It is difficult to overstate the surreal timing. While families prepared stockings and wrapped presents, officers were documenting a serial killer's admissions. 4 families, meanwhile, were facing Christmas without sons, brothers, fathers. Inside that interview room, Moore provided details about locations, movements, and weapons that corroborated evidence police already had, or would soon verify. This wasn't a vague or abstract confession. It was specific, geographic, sequential, and devastating. But confessions are complicated. After giving those admissions, Moore later withdrew them. He changed strategy. By the time of his 1996 trial at Mould Crown Court, he pleaded not guilty. His defence claimed the real killer was a man he referred to as Jason, a supposed partner who he alleged committed the murders while Moore was present but not responsible. The prosecution dismantled that claim. No credible evidence of this Jason surfaced. The jury rejected the explanation. But the existence of the retraction adds another layer to the interrogation sequence. On Christmas Eve, 1995, Moore spoke freely. Months later, he tried to undo it. Interrogation experts often point to moments of psychological tipping, when evidence is overwhelming, when isolation sets in, when the performance becomes exhausting. Moore had maintained control for months, but at Penzarn, control slipped. Anthony Davies fought back. Blood was left behind. For perhaps the first time, Moore was not dictating the narrative. Inside that interview room, facing forensic certainty, the persona cracked, and what emerged was not remorse, it was disclosure. When the case reached trial in October 1996, the confession became a central component of the prosecution's case. Combined with forensic evidence and recovered items linking more to the victims, it formed a powerful narrative of deliberate, repeated murder. The jury convicted him of all 4 killings. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, with the judge recommending he never be released. A whole life term. There's something haunting about that Christmas Eve confession. Not just what was said, but when it was said. 4 murders laid out in the early hours before a holiday built around family and forgiveness. And the man who delivered those admissions, he would later try to take them back. But by then, the evidence and the damage were irreversible. The man in black had finally spoken, and what he revealed confirmed every fear North Wales had begun to whisper. October 1996, Mould Crown Court, North Wales. By then, the name Peter Moore was no longer whispered, it was printed in headlines. He stood in the dock charged with 4 counts of murder: Henry Roberts, Edward Carthy, Keith Randles and Anthony Davies. 4 men killed between September and December 1995. The man in black was now in a grey courtroom, and for the first time, everything would be said out loud. Leading the prosecution was Alex Carlyle QC. From the outset, he framed Moore not as impulsive, but as calculating. It was Carlyle who delivered the line that would follow Moore forever. The man in black, black thoughts, and the blackest of deeds. But rhetoric alone does not convict. The prosecution built their case methodically. They laid out the timeline. September, Henry Roberts stabbed outside his Anglesey home. November 19th, Edward Carthy killed in Clochaunog Forest after being driven from Liverpool. November 26th, Keith Randles murdered near the A5. December the 12th, Anthony Davies stabbed at Penzance Beach. 4 separate crime scenes, 4 separate investigations, 1 defendant. Then came the connective tissue. The blood recovered at Penzance Beach was presented to the court. Anthony Davies had fought back. In that struggle, Moore had bled. That blood was analysed and matched to him. This was not speculative geography, it was biological presence. The jury heard how items belonging to victims were found in Moore's possession. They heard about knives recovered during searches. They heard about fibres and clothing linking him to the scenes. And they heard about Christmas Eve confession. Through testimony, the court was told how Moore had calmly admitted to the murders in the early hours of December the 24th, 1995, before later retracting those admissions. The prosecution's message was clear. This was not coincidence, not mistaken identity, not fantasy. It was pattern, proof, and admission. Then came the defence. Moore took the extraordinary step of giving evidence. He told the jury the killer was not him. He named another man, someone he called Jason. According to Moore, this Jason was responsible for the murders, and Moore had merely been present. It was a story with dramatic elements, a secretive companion, violent tendencies, shared movements across North Wales. But when examined, the claim unravelled. Investigators have found no corroboration, no credible trace of this alleged partner, no independent evidence placing Jason at the scenes. The prosecution suggested the name itself echoed horror fiction, a detail not lost on jurors. The courtroom was forced to weigh 2 possibilities: a phantom killer no one could verify, or the man sitting in front of them, tied by evidence to all 4 deaths. Trials are not only about defendants, they're about the dead. Family members of Henry Roberts, Edward Carthy, Keith Randles and Anthony Davies sat in the courtroom. They listened to the details of how loved ones were attacked. They heard the language of pathology and evidence. They heard the reported words Moore had used in confession, describing killing as for fun, describing stabbing as easy. For families, trials are not theatrical, they are endurance. Each cross-examination, a wound. After weeks of testimony, forensic evidence and cross-examination, the case went to the jury. The deliberations did not stretch endlessly. In 1996, the verdicts were returned. Guilty, 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 guilty. 4 counts of murder. The defence narrative of Jason had failed. The confession, though retracted, stood in the shadow of overwhelming corroboration, and the man in black was now legally what investigators had believed him to be, a serial killer. The judge imposed life imprisonment. A recommendation was made that Moore should never be released, a whole life term. It was a recognition not only of 4 murders, but of the pattern behind them, the calculated targeting, the escalation, the lack of remorse reflected in his own reported words. North Wales had its answer, but answers do not erase what happened. A shock rippled outward. This was not a drifter passing through, not an anonymous predator. It was a businessman, a cinema operator, a man embedded in daily life. The realization forced communities to confront a painful truth. They had not failed to notice a stranger. They had failed to see someone they thought they knew. The Moore case unsettled more than just a region. It unsettled assumptions that monsters are visibly monstrous, that danger announces itself, that evil looks chaotic. Peter Moore did not look chaotic. He looked organised, controlled, ordinary, and that may be the most disturbing detail of all. When the courtroom emptied and the headlines faded, 4 families were left without answers to the only question that truly mattered. Why? The legal system had done its job. The verdict was delivered, the sentence imposed, but the deeper discomfort lingers, because the man in black was never hiding in darkness. He was standing in plain sight. When Peter Moore was sentenced in 1996, the judge recommended he should never be released. Not in 20 years, not in 30, not on good behaviour, never. In the United Kingdom, that kind of punishment is known as a whole life order. It means exactly what it sounds like: prison until death, with no minimum term to work toward. For the families of Henry Roberts, Edward Carthy, Keith Randles and Anthony Davies, the sentence signals finality. The legal system had drawn a line as permanent as it could. But sentences, like confessions, are rarely the final chapter. Moore disappeared into the prison system. Years passed, public attention faded, North Wales moved on, as communities do, not forgetting, but continuing. Yet in prison, Moore did not simply vanish into obscurity. Like several other offenders serving whole life terms, he began challenging the legality of his sentence. Not his conviction, his punishment. The argument was not emotional, it was constitutional. In the early 2010s, Moore joined other prisoners serving whole life orders in taking their case to the European Court of Human Rights. The claim was not that they were innocent. It was that a sentence offering no realistic possibility of release amounted to inhuman or degrading treatment under Article 3 of the European Convention of Human Rights. The legal question was stark. Can a democracy impose a sentence that extinguishes hope entirely? Or must there always be some theoretical possibility of review? For families of victims, the appeals felt like reopening wounds. For the prisoners, they were framed as a matter of human rights. The courtroom drama had shifted from Mould Crown Court to international law. In 2012, Moore and others lost an initial appeal before the European Court. The court rejected their claim at that stage. For a moment, it appeared the whole life order stood firm. For victims' families, the ruling reaffirmed what the original judge had intended: permanence. But the legal battle over whole life sentences did not end there. Other cases continued moving through European courts, raising similar questions. And in 2013, in a separate but related case, the European Court ruled that while whole life sentences were not inherently unlawful, there must be some mechanism for review, a possibility, however remote, that a prisoner's sentence could be reassessed decades later. The ruling did not guarantee release, it required review, and that nuance matters. A whole life sentence is not simply about years, it is about horizon. Most prisoners, even those serving decades, can mark time. They count towards something, they imagine a distant door. A whole life order removes that horizon. More, it meant waking every day knowing that, barring extraordinary compassionate grounds, such as terminal illness, he would die inside prison walls. Some argue that this is precisely what justice demands for serial murder. Others argue that a justice system must allow for theoretical redemption, even if redemption never materialises. Moore's appeals placed him at the centre of that philosophical divide. Here's what makes this psychologically haunting. Moore once described killing as for fun. He described it as easy. Years later, he stood behind legal arguments about dignity and rights. It forces a question that sits uncomfortably with many listeners. What does justice look like for someone who showed no mercy? Is permanent imprisonment retribution, protection, or something else entirely? And what does it mean that the debate over his sentence continues long after his crimes? Peter Moore remains in prison. His whole life order stands within the framework clarified by UK courts after the European rulings, meaning it is subject to review mechanisms in theory, but in practice remains effectively lifelong. He will almost certainly die in prison, but his case became part of a broader legal shift, one that forced the UK to examine how it punishes most serious offenders. That is his legacy in law, not just 4 murders, but participation in a debate about whether any human being can be condemned without end. There is something unsettling about the passage of time in cases like this. The crimes feel frozen in 1995. The courtroom feels locked in 1996. But the legal system continues moving. Appeals are filed, judgments are written, philosophical questions resurface. Meanwhile, 4 families continue living with absence. Whole life orders attempt to create closure through permanence. But nothing about murder truly closes. Not for families, not for communities, not even for the justice system. Peter Moore's story forces us to confront something larger than one man. If someone can operate for years in plain sight, if someone can confess, retract, manipulate narrative, if someone can become both convicted killer and human rights appellant, then the line between monster and man is more complex than we want to admit. 4 men: Henry, Edward, Keith, Anthony. 4 lives that ended in darkness between September and December in 1995. And a man who walked among everyone else in daylight. Peter Moore was not a ghost. He wasn't hiding in abandoned buildings or drifting from town to town. He was present, structured, ordinary. He sold tickets. He locked up at night. He drove the same roads as his victims drove. and when we finally spoke on Christmas Eve, he described killing as easy. He said it was for fun. Those words hang in the air long after the courtroom empties, because they strip away the illusion that violence always comes from chaos. Sometimes it comes from control, from planning, from someone who understands exactly how invisible he is. A whole life sentence means Peter Moore will likely die behind prison walls, but prisons don't erase what happened on those roads, in that forest, on that beach. They don't give back birthdays or Christmas mornings or futures that were supposed to unfold. What this case leaves us with is not just anger, it leaves us with discomfort. The discomfort of knowing that evil does not always look wild. Sometimes it looks routine. Sometimes it wears black and blends in. And sometimes it sits quietly in the front row while the rest of us watch the screen. That's all for tonight's episode of What They Hide, Hidden Crimes in Plain Sight. If this story stayed with you, that's the point. Because these cases aren't just about what happened. They're about how it happened, how it was missed, and how easily the ordinary can conceal the unthinkable. If you found this episode powerful, follow the show so you never miss what comes next. And if you're listening on a platform that allows reviews, your rating helps others discover these stories too. Next time, we uncover another crime that lived quietly in plain sight until it didn't. Until then, stay aware, stay questioning, and remember, not everything hidden is in the dark.